Hello and welcome to my kitchen. My name's Jeff Klein and I am your intrepid baker today. I'm so excited to be here doing an online teaching format in this really cool way. Some of you may know me as a teacher both in Brookline Community Education and in Newton Community Education. I teach classes in 3 general categories. I do a lot of this kind of baking stuff. I also teach classes on gardening and garden design. And then I teach classes in what I always call urban homesteading, which is anything that you didn't think you could do yourself in the city, it turns out you probably can. From making beer or cider, to fermenting your own foods, making sauerkraut, pickles, yogurt, to making your own soaps. I'm proud to say that I'm probably the only instructor that has used lye, sodium hydroxide, in 2 completely different classes, one for pretzel making and one for soap making. So that's kind of neat. Anyway, I love being here when I'm not teaching these classes. I run a small fine gardening business in Brookline and in Newton. So I may have even seen some of your beautiful yards. I like to make things lovelier and more floral and more sustainable as well. So today, we're gonna focus mostly on baking, and we're going to be focusing specifically on baking artisan breads. This class is designed for a person who has never wanted to do it or never been able to do it or have always been a little bit afraid to jump right in. This class is designed for you. You don't have to have any experience at all. We're going to go from the very basics, from what is bread, all the way down to how to score your beautiful loaf of bread at the very end and make those fun cuts. And if you follow the directions and stick with it, then at the end, you're going to have your own loaf of bread. So let's start from way up high, just sort of looking down. We're going to talk for maybe a few minutes here before we get going. So way up high, what is bread? What makes bread bread, you know? And the answer is actually fairly straightforward. Bread is anytime that you take a cereal grain, that means some grass that makes seeds, whether that's wheat, the most common kind, or oat or rye. If you pound those seeds up, you get something called flour. And when you take that flour and you mix water to it and then you bake it, that is a bread. Now the thing is, if you just took flour and water and baked it, you would have something pretty awful tasting. It would break a window if it were a ball. If it were flat, you'd think it was a cracker, but then you'd bite into it and break a tooth. They called it hardtack during the Civil War. And that has existed for a long time, that particular kind of bread. 30,000 years ago, they found, basically evidence of a small clay oven that baked bread in the caves. So we know that we've been doing this for a while, but what makes it actually good? And there's 2 other ingredients to making bread. There's salt, which gives it flavor, and then there's some kind of leavening. Now, what is leavening? It can be one of, there's several combinations, but one of 2 main categories. The first one is chemical leavening, and that is baking soda or baking powder. Essentially all you're doing is you're taking that chemistry experiment that you did in 5th grade with the volcano, where you put the baking soda and the vinegar together, and it creates an acid-base reaction, and the result is a lot of bubbles and a whole bunch of carbon dioxide. So you do that in a small measured way with baking soda in baking, and it makes very, very little perfect bubbles. And those bubbles are all about the same size, and the reaction happens quick, so they're actually called quick breads if you use baking soda, or baking powder, which is a little bit different. It contains its own acid, but it doesn't matter that much. The bottom line is that if you use a chemical reagent like that, and the whole point of it is to make something rise real fast, then you're doing a quick bread. So think pancakes, cookies, things like that. But if you're using yeast, then the whole process is a lot different for looking at. It's not different in the fundamentals of what you're doing, which is trying to put air into your bread so that it gets bigger and rises and it's fluffier, it's not so hard, it's, it has a strong pull apart ability, I guess you'd call it. That's the crumb of the bread. And that process with yeast actually involves living things. Yeast are alive, they're a fungus. I know you don't really want to think about fungus in your bread, but they are, and it's just fine. What they do, like all living things, is they breathe and they respire and they do all this other stuff. But the breathing is the main part, because as they're digesting and breaking down some of your starches in your flour, they're also exhaling. They're constantly breathing, and there's billions of them. So all those little tiny breaths eventually become holes in your bread. And the holes in your bread will get bigger and bigger the longer that you let it sit, because there's more and more yeast breathing out. And so that process of letting the bread rise naturally with yeast is the more standard kind of bread baking. Now, for years, they didn't have packets of yeast. All the way up until about World War II, nobody had packets of yeast. And so what they had to do was just leave flour and water out in a nice warm area, and the wild yeast from the air would land on it. And then they would begin the process of reproducing and making that bread rise. And that is called sourdough. We're not gonna do that today. It's awesome, and we could do a whole class on just that, but we're not gonna do it today. We're gonna use standard yeast. So, what do you need to bake bread? Well, you only need a few pieces of equipment. You might hear about fancy ovens, or you need a stand mixer, or you have to have a scale or whatever else. The fact is, there's a lot of things that might make bread baking a little bit easier, but for the most part, you can just stick with what the standard basics are, and we're gonna go over them now. The first is a bowl. Now, I use a very big bowl when I can. I like the biggest possible bowl because I don't want flour to get everywhere, all over everything, and I want to be able to work it with my hands and not have to worry about it spilling everywhere. So a big bowl if you've got it. You need, if you can, a kitchen scale. Kitchen scales are super useful. This isn't even one, this is officially a US postage scale, but it's helpful for weighing your ingredients. When you weigh your ingredients, you know that you have a lot more specificity and perfection in what you're doing. So that's just dynamite. If you don't have a kitchen scale, by the way, you shouldn't worry too much about it, because you can also just use, measuring cups. I like to use liquid measurers if I'm not using a scale. That would be these larger sort of Pyrex ones. And the reasons for it we'll get into later, but if you have those, great. If not, the standard cup, half cup, quarter cup, those are just fine too. And then you need an oven. That's really it. It helps to have a clean countertop. If you don't have a clean countertop, you can always put parchment or wax or even saran wrap down to work, but you will expect to have one of these surfaces get a little bit floury, so make sure it's good and clean before. What do you need in terms of ingredients? Only 4. That's the best part about baking bread. It's totally straightforward. You need flour, and I always use this King Arthur flour when I can, but it doesn't matter that much. You need water. Any water will do. You might hear people say, oh, well, you gotta use water from New York, that makes it the best, or you gotta use San Francisco water. There's a lot of science in bread baking, and there's a lot of apocryphal stuff in bread baking. To my mind and to my experience, any water will do, provided that it's clean water. You need salt. I always use coarse kosher salt, and the reason I do is because larger grains of salt tend to be a little bit more flavorful. You sort of come upon them on your taste buds rather than having the whole thing be sort of equally salty all the way throughout. Anyway, and then finally, you need yeast. You can use the packets if you have them. You can use a jar if you can, or even better still, if you can get one of those big bricks that they might sell at Costco or one of the big box stores that are 1 pound worth of yeast. You can put them in Ziploc bags, large bags in your fridge, and then use them for like a year and a half. You do not need to refrigerate yeast, although if it's out of its container, sometimes it helps increase the life of it longer. Those are the 4 ingredients, and that's the main equipment. So we're gonna go from there and just get right into how to bake the bread. Sounds good? Let's go. And we're ready to go. We're back. I've brought with me for baking today my intrepid 8-year-old baking helper. You want to say hi?
Hi.
Nice. So we are going to work together right now to make our very first loaf of bread in this course. A brief word before we get going on mixing all the ingredients is that most of you are probably accustomed to measuring flour by having a scoop of, a cup or so of flour. So I measure everything when I do a loaf of bread by weight. And what that means is that I use a scale, a kitchen scale, and you can pick one of these up on Amazon for like 15 bucks if you want. I don't work for a kitchen scale company. I'm not a rep or anything. I find it really useful because a packed cup of flour is a whole lot different than a loose cup of flour when it comes to the amount of flour that you're actually putting into your bread. And if you accidentally end up using too much flour, then you might get a really dry bread. But if you weigh it, you never have to wonder. So I'll take my bowl and I'll put 400 grams of flour to start. When you use 400 grams of flour, that usually is a great start for a good loaf of bread for a family of 4, which is what we've got. And so, yeah, you can go ahead and put it in. If you don't have kitchen scale, that's okay. You can use one of these guys. The main thing is that you see what we poured in here. In order to put in the right amount, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to gently pour the flour directly into the liquid measurer. If I didn't put it directly into the liquid measurer, if I scooped somehow using a regular cup, then that would be a lot more packed in and that might really change the ratio, sorry. With water, it's a little less of a big deal. It doesn't pack or stretch, obviously. What I always say is that you can, however much flour you use, if you can use 65% of that amount in water, then you're good to go. So in this case, if you don't have a scale, that's just fine. You can use 3 cups of flour and 1 1/3 cup of water and mix them together. So you see here that Jules put these in. You can go give it a good circle around. And she mixed the flour and the water. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait, don't you have to do something crazy with the yeast? The answer is no, you don't. We'll just put the yeast in regular. A lot of folks will tell you that you're supposed to get a bowl of water with a little bit of sugar and then put the yeast in and wait 5 minutes. That's called proofing yeast. And it used to be super necessary, and it is no longer super necessary. Yeast is tested and approved, and unless you're visiting a friend who you haven't been to their house in a long time and you're not sure if this house on the Cape has had the same yeast in there for 15 years, probably that yeast is just fine and you can just add it directly to your bread. So that's what we're gonna do in just a moment here. But in the meantime, you see that Jules is working around the edges. That's great. And we're gonna make sure that it really mixes in there too. Don't forget the sides, like that. So you see what I'm doing? You wanna keep going with that? You see that at first, the water doesn't really wanna get into the flour, and so it seems real dry. But the more that you work on it, and I think we're probably done with the spatula at this point. I think we gotta start using our hands. Go for it. Then the more you work it, the more you'll see that slowly that water begins to absorb into the flour, and that's important. There you go. You notice that you gotta have clean hands or free of dirt. It doesn't matter so much about the germs because you're gonna be baking this very hot for a long time, but you don't wanna have a lot of dirt on your hands because it's gonna come right off. How you doing? See how she's working fairly fast. She's not just sitting there like a sloth. She's getting going, and that's super helpful. And then we're gonna keep working on this for about, I don't know, another minute or two before we start adding our next ingredients, okay? So we've gotten this down to a ball now, and we're still working on getting the flour off our hands. Word to the wise, if you work fast like this, you won't get it stuck, whereas if you go slower, then you'll find that a lot more sticks to you. So you wanna go real fast. Anyway, once you've got yourself a nice ball, that's when you move on to your next ingredient, which in this case is salt. You wanna dump that in there? And then you're gonna work that in, it's gotta be all gone. You don't wanna see the salt. You want all the salt just sort of disappear into it. Take my measure back. It doesn't so much matter if you add the yeast before the salt or the salt before the yeast. The thing that does matter is that you don't want to add them at the exact same time because sometimes they don't play too nice together. So we're going to wait until we don't see any more big grains of salt, and then we're going to put the yeast in. A packet of yeast is generally, oh, that's looking good. A packet of yeast is generally 2 1/4 teaspoons, right? So 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast makes a packet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's all you have to use. You can use a little bit more or a little bit less, which is super helpful if you need to change the speed of your baking. So we are gonna make this bread this we're gonna have it baked for this afternoon. So I would have ideally have done it this morning if I wanted to just use 1 packet of yeast, but we wanna get going faster. So I'm not gonna use just 2 1/4 teaspoons. I'm gonna use closer to 3 teaspoons, which is the same thing as 1 tablespoon. So I go directly into the yeast and I'm gonna dump it in. You wanna do the honors?
Yes.
Nice. You see that? We've just put it right over it. Again, we haven't added honey or done anything wacky that involves, proofing it for a while. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just not necessary, and it's one more step. We're trying to make bread easy. 4 ingredients, 4 steps, and then just a few after that. So you're really getting it in there. You can keep pushing it onto here and it'll stick to it. There you go, and then flip it over. So you see, there's no particular method here. We're just kind of moving around and getting the stuff on the yeast into it. If you want a very specific method, you can get into that when you're, a little bit more expert. There's specific folds and styles of kneading that you can do. It's actually a real leg workout because you're often posed like this and you're working real hard. If you have a stand mixer also, then you can let the stand mixer do all this work. You can go right into, go ahead. Yeah. You can go right onto mixer setting number 2. But if you don't, then anything you're gonna do with a bread this dry, remember that we're talking about 65% of the amounts of flour is the amounts of water that we use. Every bread has a different, that's called the hydration, and every bread has a different kind of hydration. A really wet bread like a ciabatta or a focaccia, those can be 85, 90%, get it in there, 85 or 90%, and those are harder to work with in terms of dough, but the result of a wetter bread is much bigger holes and a much more interesting sort of shape and profile. A drier bread gives you more uniform holes, and it's a little bit easier to work with. I can put my hands on it here and not have to worry about it kind of falling through my fingers like a focaccia might if I were working with it. So, what do you think? This is pretty good. Do you see any other holes in here, Julie?
No.
I think we've mixed in all of the flour and all of the water and the salt and the yeast. I'm going to give it one last feel around and see if there's any bumps. We're looking for clumps. We're looking for areas where the flour might have stuck together. And it looks like it's pretty smooth, right?
Yeah.
Great. So throw it back in here. And then let me show you the last step, which is simply to let this sit for a couple of hours. Okay? Now, people will tell you, let it sit for, and they'll give you some exact amount of time. There is no exact amount of time on this. I really want to emphasize that doing great baking is different from doing perfect baking. All we're doing is great baking. And the barrier to entry on that is you don't have to worry too much or fuss too much about exactly how much you do. What you want is for it to, about double in size. If it's about doubled in size, and that happens faster on warmer days or in a warmer kitchen, and it happens slower on winter days, but if it doubles in size, then you're ready to go. All right, so we'll pick it up in a minute. So it's been about 2 hours. This has now doubled in size, and you can take a look at it here. You can sort of see that there's bubbles going on and it's moving all around. What's nice about this area, this amount of bread, is that it's gonna get much bigger when it goes in the oven, but it's not so large now that it's impossible to handle. This next step is the last step really before baking. And all we're gonna do with this is take the bread out of the container that it's in, bring it to the counter, give it a couple of folds, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then we're going to put it right back in the bowl for 1 more hour. At that point, we'll move it on. We'll preheat our oven in a little bit, and then we'll get it going. So when I remove something from a bowl, I don't just yank at it because there's air in there and we want to keep some of that air in there. So I just kind of gently do this, and now it's turned out onto the floor or onto the table. I hope it's not turned onto the floor. But you see at this point, we can make any number of shapes with this. If we were making a baguette, we would be pulling it out and we'd be slowly, working it until it was quite long. But we're not doing that here. We're making something called a boule. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of fold it, and you see I'm working very gently here, but I'm folding it sort of like an envelope. And the idea is that I'm going to have all of the seams in one little area, and then I'm going to put that area face down. Now at this point, all I've done is I've just kind of turned it over one more time, and I've locked the air that's in there in, a little bit more. So it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to escape. What that means is that it's not in my interest right now to smash this or smack it or pound it back down. There are reasons for second rises, but we're not doing a fancy loaf of bread right now. We're doing an excellent loaf of bread that will taste great and will be delightful and really great to look at. And that's all you need. I've always said that when you're baking, you can get to 80% of the way to expert in 20% of the time. And then that last 20% from going to, wow, that guy's pretty good, or that person's pretty good, to that person should open a store, that person's amazing. That can take a lifetime. And I've not mastered that yet. If I did, I'd have my own bakery, right? But getting to terrific, you don't have to do a lot. So here we are at terrific. This bread, what I'll do now is I'm gonna slowly, without smooshing it too much, pick it right back up and put it right back into our container. And I'm gonna try to keep the shape. I'm gonna focus on having any seams or any places that I folded it sticking underneath it so that they hold themselves together. And the whole bread will stay like this. And I'm gonna let this sit for about an hour. This is a second rise of sorts, but mostly it's just getting the bread, totally ready for baking. It's not gonna get a whole lot bigger, but it's going to there's a lot of chemistry that happens in this last section, but it's not that important. The important thing is that we're gonna get it set to the shape that we want. And I could have done this, I guess, on the actual sheet that I was baking it on, but there's no need for that right now. So I'm gonna put it right back into my bowl, and then you'll see in a little bit when we go back to this that we're gonna take it out and we're gonna turn it out onto the sheet after we've preheated our oven. So that's all we've got for now. So when last I saw you, we had this guy that we had folded and put the seams underneath, right? We now have a loaf of bread that's gotten pretty big. It's airy, you can poke at it, and you can definitely tell that there's a lot of air in there. So now what we're gonna do is we're going to set it out, turn it out is what they call it, directly onto a piece of parchment paper. Now, if you were a fancier baker or you were more interested in doing a more particularly shaped loaf, then you might want to use something like a pizza peel, which is that thing that you slide the pizza in and out of the oven for. But you don't need to do that. Don't let anybody convince you that you have to do that. Instead, what I do is I put parchment paper down on an oven sheet, and parchment paper is useful because it really, nothing sticks to it, as you know. And also it keeps your oven tray itself pretty clean. And thirdly, if you wanted to brush it with egg or anything else, we'll do that in another episode, then you would really be able to do that without making any kind of a mess. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my bread and I'm going to very gently work my way out of it. Work it out of the container is what I mean to say. The key here is that we do not want to let the air out, and we do not want to take that seam that we had and put it anywhere other than on the bottom. So I've got this here, and what I'm gonna do is I'm going to give it one last little bit of shape, and that's just with quick hands underneath, just like that. Now this is ready to go into the oven. We've done all the final rising, so we're good to go here when it comes to anything else. As you see, there's little holes that are rising and bubbles that are coming up out of it. So when you look at it, you can really tell that it's going to get quite big. The next step when it goes in the oven, which I just preheated to 450, you probably heard it go off. The next step when it goes into the oven will be that it's going to have something called oven spring. And that is all the little holes that are in there contain air. Well, when air warms, it expands. And so immediately in the first 5 minutes or so, when it goes in the oven, it's gonna get a lot bigger. And then the whole thing is that it's kind of cool actually. It's a race between how fast the crust can harden on the outside, thus making it not get any bigger, versus how fast it can rise. And so there's sort of a battle royale happening between those two things in those first 5 to 10 minutes. Once it's in the oven though, we're not gonna open the oven really at all if we have a choice, because we really wanna keep it as hot as possible in there. I put mine on 450. You can even go higher than that. If you have a small upper oven, then you might wanna lower it down to 400 once you get that oven spring. But otherwise, we're ready to go. So I'm gonna bake this for about 35 minutes. I can't tell you exactly, because every oven's different, exactly how long it'll be, but I will say that I'm going to look at it and wait for a deep, rich golden brown on the top, and that's how I'll know it's ready. All right, here we go. Took it out of the oven. Bread looks great. You'll notice there's a bubble right here, and that's fine. There's ways to solve for that, especially if you're deeper in the process with how you fold everything down. But for now, not a big deal. Doesn't affect the flavor at all. It just looks a little odd. You'll see there's a nice rich brown on the top, and then as you get to the bottom, you've got a more golden brown. I let it stay out of the oven for about 10 minutes to cool off, and now we're gonna cut right into it and see what we've got. So When we look in here, we see just what we want to see, which is irregular holes, lots of different shapes, a nice thick crust that really came, nice and deep. As this cools all the way down, you'll be able to cut it for sandwich bread, but at least for right now, it'll be delicious warm with a little bit of butter, and it'll be fantastic for dinner. So thanks so much, and we will see you again when we do this the next time.